many reasons why we know the Earth is very ancient and all life descends from a common ancestor. Likewise, there are nearly endless reasons as to why we know that alternative ideas, like those of Young Earth Creationism, are entirely untenable. I spend a lot of time arguing with Young Earth Creationists both online and in my real life, at my real job, and as a result, I've come to the conclusion that my favorite argument to use against the idea is that of the heat problem. Those of you who have followed this channel for any modicum of time have heard of the heat problem before, and that's probably in part because I've intentionally tried to popularize it. This is because it's such a comically lethal blow to Young Earth Creationism that I think it should be in more people's back pocket when they're talking to friends and relatives about why they might be Young Earth Creationists. There are many other bodies of data that are problematic for Young Earth Creationism, but I like the heat problem in particular because it's actually preclusionary and in such a clear way. So today, I thought that we would look at the heat problem, but specifically look at it in the realm of creation science. Creation science is the pseudoscientific field that is propped up by degree-holding creationists. Sometimes they're young Earth creationists, sometimes old Earth creationists, and sometimes they're even intelligent design proponents. But the overall goal of creation science is to try to show that their ideas hold scientific merit and indeed deserve to stand toe-to-toe with conventional science. What it really is, in my personal opinion, is typically three evangelicals in a lab coat that are masquerading as scientists. The reason I hold this opinion is because in the many years that I've been operating this channel and talking with creationists of all stripes, the vast majority of them put forward work that is not very rigorous and often unempirical. It is particularly interesting to me that a lot of these young Earth creationist scientists practicing creation science do fine work when it is in the realm of conventional secular science, but the moment it dips a toe into proving or supporting young Earth creationism, the robusticity of it all really takes a nosedive. To be abundantly clear, this does not mean that every creationist, no matter what variety of creationists they are, is a pseudoscience. I'm simply saying that it is my opinion that the body of creation science tends to be absolutely riddled with bad methods, incorrect data, and unfortunately, sometimes intentional deceit. So you might be wondering, well, how do they support creationism? Because typically when you think about creationism, you only think about their attempts to bash evolution or the ancient age of the Earth. What about their own models? And typically, creationist models, namely young Earth creationist models, attempt to take biblical events and show support for them scientifically. One of the most popular of these events to attempt to support is, of course, Noah's Ark. Now, if you're new to the channel, that might have been quite jarring to hear, but it does kind of make sense, right? Noah's Ark is the story of a worldwide flood. If the Bible is literally true and claims that a literal flood did indeed happen, which I also don't hold to, I don't think that's hermeneutically sound, but if you do hold to that, then, of course, that support should exist in the Earth, in fields like geology, physics, biology, paleontology, and much, much more. Creation scientists, like those that work at Answers in Genesis, CMI, or ICR, often spend a lot of their time trying to form a coherent model that makes Noah's Ark make sense. Usually this is done by incorporating several different fields, like those of geology, paleontology, and physics, as well as astronomy, in order to ground the idea of a worldwide flood in science. The idea is that this would give them some legitimacy. If they could show that there's even an inkling of a chance that Noah's Ark actually happened, well, that's a whole lot of support for the literal interpretation of the Bible as seen by a young Earth creationist. It doesn't really matter to them that every other scientist that isn't a young Earth creationist disagrees with them and sees no evidence that a globe-spanning flood that occurred 4,400 years ago is responsible for the entire geologic column, all the fossils within that column, the positioning of the continents, and radiometric decay dates. They want young Earth creationism to be true, and Ken Ham simply needs to justify the big-ass boat that he built in the middle of Kentucky. As a result, flood models that creation scientists propose aim to make sense of conventional science in the context of the global flood, namely that of the geologic column. Now, the geologic column spans all of Earth's history, 4.5 billion years worth, with complex life dominating the past 500 million years. Creationists generally propose that at least the last 500 million years worth of geology was due to the flood. So we are cramming 500 million years worth of processes into a single year, which is the amount of time that it took for the Noah's Ark event to occur. This includes, of course, radioactive decay, the movement of the continents, impact events, sedimentation and compaction, deposition, the life cycles of all the organisms living during this vast time period, and much, much more. There is a caveat here, though, and that has to do with radioactive decay. You see, creationists need to explain the radioactive dates that we have for the age of the Earth today, and so as a result, some young Earth creationists propose that the past 4.5 billion years worth of decay happened during the flood and was accelerated, while others only propose that the past 500 million years worth of accelerated decay happened during the flood. This is, of course, the flood model. It is a model that attempts to explain the state of things currently through the lens of the Noachian deluge. And the most popular flood model is that proposed by John Baumgartner, Catastrophic Plate Tectonics, or CPT. This is actually the most popular flood model. Catastrophic plate tectonics goes something like this. Before the flood, Earth was a single supercontinent. Answers in Genesis, which accepts CPT, proposes that this was Rodinia. Then, during the flood, plate tectonics occurred, but catastrophically, or on fast forward. Slabs of oceanic crust broke loose and subducted along the continental margins, which lowered the viscosity of the mantle, leading to meters per second runaway subduction. This means the continental plates were moving faster than a race car. During this process, Baumgartner also proposes that the Earth's magnetic field rapidly reversed several times. The massive amounts of heat caused huge amounts of water to evaporate into steam, which then caused a global rain. Flood basalts erupted all over the planet, and the lighter mantle material of the new ocean floors made them rise, allowing oceans to flood the continents. The flood carried and redistributed the sediments, effectively creating the geologic column of the past 500 million years. At some point during the flood, much like the sped-up movement of the continents, nuclear decay also accelerated and is responsible for all our modern nuclear dates, reading ages that are significantly older than 6,000 years. The process finally slowed down once nearly all the old ocean floor had been subducted, and today's rates are a consequence of that. Subsequent cooling of the ocean basins caused them to sink away to their current position, the water recedes, Noah's Ark lands on Mount Ararat, and life begins anew. Now, if all of that sounds really silly, like it doesn't make very much sense at all, then you're not alone. CPT is espoused, however, by all of the major Young Earth creationist organizations, despite the fact that it is plagued with more holes than a trypophobia museum. In fact, there are several open questions that immediately come to mind. The flood allegedly starts because the oceanic crust splits open. Well, what caused this to occur? What triggers the rapid subduction, where the plates are moving at race car speeds atop the mantle? How does Baumgartner suppose the viscosity of the mantle changes to avoid lethal amounts of heat from the friction alone? Why do we have more sediment on the continents than in the seas, where the water supposedly flowed back as the oceans receded? Why don't we see any evidence of this massive water flow back to the sea as we do for localized megafloods like those seen in the Scablands? Why are the animals and plants fossilized in evolutionary order when they occupy similar niches? How does this model tackle coral clocks, limestone deposition rates, planktonic biomass, and the evidence from the orbital monsoon hypothesis? None of these questions have answers, but worse yet is the issue of heat. Hey, that's the entire point of the video. It turns out a lot of things release heat, like radioactive decay, impact events, limestone formation, magma hardening, continental drift, and many, many more. So that's just a little sampling of some things that are going to release a lot of heat if you take 4.5 to 500 million years worth of those processes and cram it into a single year of the flood. And I would like to look at how much heat they release specifically in the context of CPT. Let's start with radioactive decay. Radiometric dating, which is rooted in the radioactive decay law, is what gives us the 4.5 billion years of age for the Earth. Modern creationists suggest that most of the decay that has ever occurred happened during the creation week and during the flood, and given they only have 6,000 years to work with, this decay has to be seriously accelerated. According to conventional science, accelerated decay does not happen in nature and cannot happen substantially at all. If it did, this would be enormous for the energy industry. Baumgartner and other CPT proponents don't pretend to have a mechanism for it either, but let's say we did have a mechanism and could figure out how to accelerate nuclear decay. What would happen if you crammed 4.5 billion years of nuclear decay, or even 500 million years worth of nuclear decay, into 1 year? Well, nuclear decay releases heat and radiation, so accelerating nuclear decay results in lethal conditions to a comically insane degree. Friend of the channel, Jordan of the Reasons to Doubt podcast, helped me drum up some math. By taking the heat output today and applying it back in time, we end up with 1.68 times 10 raised 30 joules of energy for major nuclear decay chains over the past 4.5 billion years. This is equivalent to 4.01 times 10 raised 14 1 megaton hydrogen bombs. This means every cubic kilometer gets its own 402 hydrogen bombs, and every square kilometer gets its own 787,884 hydrogen bombs. Some creationists like to take the majority of that 4.5 billion years worth of accelerated nuclear decay and stick it into the creation week on like day 3 before God creates any living things. So God makes the planet, accelerates the nuclear decay, artificially aging the Earth, and then sticks all the living things on that planet. Of course, they can only take this so far because they do propose that the flood is responsible for at least 500 million years worth of the geologic column. So in that case, the most that they can stick into the creation week is about 4 billion years, leaving 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay for the flood. So how much heat do you get from just 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay? We just have to take 1/9 of our initial number. 500 million years worth of decay is 1.86 times 10 raised 29 joules and equivalent to 4.45 times 10 raised 13 hydrogen bombs. This is equivalent to 87,237 H-bombs per square kilometer. To put it another way, University of Florida geologist Joe Meert did his own math and showed that the thermal gradient, if you start accelerated nuclear decay at creation, you end up with an immediate 65,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer, which cools to a nice 40,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer by the time Noah's flood occurs, and 400 degrees Celsius per kilometer by Jesus' birth. This is 13 to 14 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Oh, but those are mean secular numbers. What are the Young Earth creationists saying about their own models? Well, geologist Andrew Snelling, who's worked at Answers in Genesis, has given up some numbers for accelerated nuclear decay, and he does give himself a little bit more leeway, starting the accelerated nuclear decay at 500 million years ago, or rather 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay during Noah's flood, which gets you a temperature of 22,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer during Noah's flood, which is of course still completely untenable. Institute for Creation Research member Dr. Larry Vardman notes, the amount of heat produced by a decay rate 1,000,000 times faster than normal during the year of the flood could potentially vaporize Earth's oceans, melt the crust, and obliterate the surface of the Earth. In fact, Vardman's right, because we have the brute numbers for what it would take energy-wise to boil off the oceans or vaporize them off instantly. To get all the oceans boiling, we need 5.6 times 10 raised 26 joules, and to vaporize them off instantly, we need 3.7 times 10 raised 27 joules. Both our 4.5 billion number of accelerated nuclear decay and our 500 million number of accelerated nuclear decay easily get us there. Okay, so accelerated nuclear decay alone makes Noah's Ark impossible, but we actually have more heat to get rid of, because you have to take all of the impact events, like the meteor that killed all of the dinosaurs from the past 500 million years, and those have to happen during the flood too, since the flood is responsible for that whole column. So let's add up the heat generated from the top 10, let's say, impact events of the past 500 million years. Using relatively conservative numbers, we get 4.47 times 10 raised 26 joules of energy, equivalent to another 99 billion hydrogen bombs. This number comes from my physics friend, Dakota. So let's talk about limestone next, because there is an absolute shit tons worth of limestone on this planet, and we need an explanation for it because it's all during that past 500 million years worth of time. Limestone is problematic in and of itself because it actually requires warm, calm, non-acidic waters to deposit, but let's just allow them the deposition and charge them for the heat that it takes for limestone to actually form. Since calcite formation releases heat, to account for today's limestone numbers, we get another 5.6 times 10 raised 27 joules for approximately 1 trillion more hydrogen bombs. I thought this one was funny because if you had asked me what releases more heat, the top 10 asteroid impacts on the Earth or just the hardening of all the limestone for the past 500 million years, I would have gotten that question wrong. Magma hardening too creates issues. In order to account for all of the hardened magma we have today, we can go ahead and add 5.4 times 10 raised 27 joules, or another approximately 1 trillion hydrogen bombs. And finally, Baumgartner himself estimates the heat release just for subducting all the plates and moving them along the surface of the mantle from a supercontinent position to now, and the number he gives is 10 raised 28 joules. This is equivalent to approximately another 2 trillion hydrogen bombs, and it's probably an underestimate too, since we know there have been 7 supercontinents, not 1 or 2. Okay, so setting aside all of the other geologic issues intrinsic to flood models, as well as the radiation problem, and considering only a handful of variables that produce heat here, we end up with a whopping total of 2 times 10 raised 29 joules for the heat released during catastrophic plate tectonics. This is equivalent to 4.78 times 10 raised 13 hydrogen bombs for 93,707 bombs per square kilometer, or 48 bombs per cubed kilometer. Understandably, Baumgartner has tacitly admitted that his model of CPT does not work without miracles. And the big YEC orgs that promote it, like Answers in Genesis, CMI, and ICR, admit that it is a currently unsolved issue, and it may indeed be unsolvable without God's intervention. This, I think, is an understatement. There's no way to do it with physics as we know it right now. You have to break it at the quantum level to make this work. And I think this is why the RATE team, a group of young Earth creationists from the late 90s who aimed to debunk radiometric dating, came to the conclusion that they're going to need exotic future physics or a miracle to solve this issue and make flood models work. And I really think that the heat problem is not utilized enough by people who argue against young Earth creationism. This is a full stop preclusion, right? You have a choice here if you're a young Earth creationist. You can either appeal to a miracle or you can break physics. Those are the only two options, and I wish that this was put forward more. Okay, so you would think this is the end of the video, right? But what if I were to tell you that there is another young Earth creationist, a much more fringe character with his own fancy flood model that he proposes does not need a miracle, and that produces 100 times more heat than catastrophic plate tectonics? You would say, that's insane. You would say, that's lunacy, Gutsick-Gibbon. You would say, tell me more. Walt Brown is the perpetrator of the Hydroplate hypothesis. Like creation scientists from CPT, Walt Brown does have a PhD. He's a retired military officer, and he runs the Center of Scientific Creation with his wife. His relationship with young Earth creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis and others is considered contentious at best. He evidently refuses to publish in their magazines, perhaps because some of the harshest critics of Hydroplate are other young Earth creationists. And in fact, we'll be using some of their work here today. So, okay, what is Hydroplate? Put simply, Hydroplate proposes that the flood's waters come from an immense ocean of water existing 10 miles underground, which was released by a catastrophic rupture of Earth's crust, shot above the atmosphere, and then fell down as rain. However, it claims to be able to explain a whole lot more than that, so let's just go through it step by step. The pre-flood world is a very strange place in Walt Brown's model. Enormous bodies of water, which Walt thinks are the fountains of the great deep mentioned in the Bible, sit below the crust of the earth instead of the mantle. This crust is a world-spanning granite slab that is about 10 to 60 miles thick, depending on the location one is measuring and the decade you're asking Walt Brown the question. Initially, Brown thought that this crust was smooth, but in 2003, Morton pointed out that the Bible supposes there were mountains in the pre-flood world, so now Walt thinks that these mountains were formed by the sagging of the original smooth crust, which he refers to as the pillars of the earth. There is no support via experiment or observation that granite can act like what is essentially a putty without heat, pressure, and immense amounts of time, but for the sake of the argument, we will grant Walt Brown his impossible geology. To Brown, the start of the flood is initiated as this subcrustal water breaks free, bursting forth and creating vast cracks along the earth, not unlike the seam of a baseball. Why did it break free? Well, unlike catastrophic plate tectonics, Brown has a reason: tidal pumping from the moon. Pause. Doesn't this theologically mean that Adam and Eve were created and placed on what is essentially a ticking time bomb? Because in Walt's view, God made the moon and the tides and Adam and Eve, and tidal pumping is what caused the flood. So what would have happened if Adam and Eve just never ate from the apple? Would the flood have happened anyways? I don't know if Walt has actually answered this question. Due to the nature of this subcrustal water being superheated and hyperpressurized by the granite crust sitting on top of it, any earthquake, no matter how minor, in the pre-flood world would have initiated the flood. So Brown and his supporters proposed that plate tectonics simply didn't happen before the flood at all. This is problematic because Precambrian rock, which essentially all young Earth creationists think is created rock from before the flood, is wrought with fault lines. These Precambrian faults are additionally not found in Walt Brown's predicted locations and are chock full of microfossils. Why would created rock be full of dead things if death didn't happen before Eve ate the apple? Come to think of it, this one is problematic for CPT too, and I've never heard a creationist answer to this question. But let's suppose that the fault lines are in the right places and the microfossils don't exist.
Go on home, Walter. Let me handle this.
Let's pretend for Walter. What happens next? Brown's model has the water spewing forth along these mega fault lines and ejecting insane amounts of Earth rock. Some of these rocks escape Earth's orbit and end up creating the outer comets, asteroids, and every single crater in the solar system from Pluto to Mercury. Wait, it's worse than you think. Now, the asteroid belt alone has a mass that is about 3% of the moon, but that's just from those still in orbit. What about all of the asteroids that cratered planets like Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Pluto? What about the craters of the rocky moons orbiting the gas giants? Here's 5,223 named craters in the solar system, as well as countless unnamed craters. Many of these craters have diameters greater than our Chicxulub crater, which was the second biggest impact event on Earth. So putting all of that together, Glenn Kubin estimates that if all those craters came from Earth ejecta, the planet would have to be several times larger in the past. Physicist Gerard Jellison's calculations have the masses being over 100 times greater than the mass of the Earth today. Impossible, of course. Other young Earth creationists have noted that prior to this whole issue, the amount of energy required to get all of this material off the planet in the first place is insane. Danny Faulkner did some math and showed that if we used 1/1,000,000th of Brown's proposed energy, we end up heating the atmosphere by 34 degrees Celsius. All of it would heat it to 34 million degrees Celsius. But believe it or not, Walt has done his own math for the expulsion of all this material. He thinks that to account for all of the material that was ejected from Earth during Hydroplate, we need 2.2 times 10 raised 31 joules. In other words, this is equivalent to that 5,000 trillion 1 megaton H-bomb number from earlier. Each cubic kilometer gets its own 5,000 hydrogen bombs. This is the most ridiculous number you're going to hear from this video, and of course makes Walt Brown's hydroplate idea impossible, which is supported by both the secular community and other young Earth creationists alike. Incredibly, Walt Brown does not agree with this sentiment. In fact, he thinks that his heat problem is almost entirely mitigated. Allow me to explain. Brown proposes that the flexed granitic crust upon the initial rupture created a piezoelectric effect. This is a real effect where electricity is generated by flexing minerals like quartz, but Walt proposes that this effect generated extremely powerful electrical surges within Earth's crust, much like bolts of lightning, which produced equally powerful magnetic forces that squeezed atomic nuclei together in a process called a Z-pinch into highly unstable super-heavy elements that quickly fissioned and decayed into subatomic particles and various isotopes, some of which were radioactive. Then, accelerated radioactive decay also occurred when a second piezoelectric effect happened months later. Picture it like this. You've got the Earth, it bursts open like an egg, and out comes the floodwaters. At that rupture, it causes the wiggling or fluttering of the granitic crust, which in turn generates these piezoelectric effects, which in turn themselves create the radioactive elements thanks to something called a Z-pinch. Then, months later into the flood, thanks to the shifting and moving around of all the plates that have now been created, we get a second piezoelectric effect that generates a second Z-pinch that accelerates the nuclear decay, resulting in today's given ancient ages. If all of that sounds absolutely impossible and insane, that's because it is. First and foremost, a piezoelectric effect that strong is entirely impossible. We have piezoelectric effects today when some earthquakes occur, and there is no heavy element formation or accelerated nuclear decay in the rocks where it happens. John Baumgartner, a Young Earth Creationist, has also pointed out that there is a maximum limit to granite fluctuation, or fluttering as Brown calls it, and this maximum is too low to generate the effect needed. But some of his other points have a ghost of a connection to real-world research. Brown suggests that this super powerful piezoelectric effect caused a Z-pinch, which in turn created the heavy elements. The use of Z-pinch comes from the Proton 21 lab, which I have talked about on this channel before. Put simply, the Proton 21 lab claims to have mimicked nucleosynthesis to create super heavy elements. Super heavy elements are unstable and rapidly decay into more common elements that can be found in Earth's crust. So Walt is using their process of the Z-pinch to explain the formation of radioactive elements, which he believes God did not initially create because radioactive elements are bad for you. The issue is the conditions the Proton 21 lab mimicked are those of nucleosynthesis. They are the conditions found in the bellies of modern stars. So to get his super heavy elements, Brown needs to make Earth into a plasma. He claims he can get rid of the heat required for making these elements by something called cold repacking, which is also pulled from the Proton 21 lab work. But again, their conditions were mimicking those of stars, so Earth must at least be in a plasma state. So yeah, you can make super heavy elements that rapidly decay into heavy elements if the Earth is a molten plasma, just like a star. Of course, you know, the arc won't survive. But oddly enough, Walt invokes a second piezoelectric effect to accelerate the decay of these newly formed heavy elements like uranium. And to get rid of the heat from accelerating nuclear decay, he invokes both the work of Proton 21 and that of Bosch 1996. The Proton 21 work can be dismissed at this point because, again, it requires the conditions of a star to apply, but would you be surprised if I told you that Bosch 1996 similarly requires the conditions of a plasma because it is also investigating the processes of stellar interiors? So all of Walt's mechanisms seem to require the Earth to be a plasma, like a star, in order for them to apply. That doesn't really help your heat problem, does it? And even then, the proposition of cold repacking being adiabatic and getting rid of the heat as it creates it is only relevant to the work of Proton 21, not Bosch 1996. So he can only really mitigate that heat, even if the Earth is already a plasma, in the creation of the radiometric elements themselves, not the acceleration of them. We could consider all of the other sources of heat, like what we did for CPT, things like impact events, the friction of the continents on the crust, the cooling of magma, and the formation of limestone, but honestly, even all combined, they're dwarfed by just the energy Walt needs to launch all of that material into the outer reaches of space. To be clear, Walt is saying that he has this amount of heat thanks to all the shenanigans that he's pulling in the Earth's crust. So Walt Brown's number that he himself gives for his own model is in fact enough energy for 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs, and this is kind of impossible, right? Okay, so we're already looking at a lot of heat here. How on earth does Walt propose we get around this heat problem? Well, like I said, a lot of the nuclear processes Walt incorrectly understands and thinks he can get rid of by applying non-applicable mechanisms that require the conditions of a star to actually work. But just for fun, let's ignore that lethal issue and focus on the additional heat just to see how Walt thinks we can maybe get around it. After all, we have a lot of heat to work with, considering we've got several oceans worth of super pressurized, supercritical water under a granite crust that wraps around the entire Earth, bursting forth, traveling up and exchanging heat with the atmosphere the entire way, and then raining back down as a storm. Remember Faulkner's math from earlier, where the heat exchange between these super hot fountains of water and the atmosphere would heat it to 34 million degrees Celsius? Well, Walt and his friend Brian Nichol have a few mitigations they want to try out. First, they suggest that the heat is directed and that space can act as a massive heat sink. They use a blowtorch as an illustration here. But as Faulkner's math showed, heat is exchanged along the margins of these fountains all the way up to the exosphere, flash cooking it the entire way up. Nichol has attempted to argue that only the boundaries of the fountains would exchange heat with the surroundings, but also seems to not understand that Walt's model has fountains rather than jets, making his mitigation inapplicable. Another argument he makes is that once in the exosphere, the steam would behave as a perfect gas, failing to consider that steam condensates and becomes a fluid. To even reach space, Danny Faulkner has noted that the speed the water would need to reach is Mach 150, and they would need to be hypersonic jets rather than the fountains Walt Brown suggests. To get hypersonic jets, the openings in the granite would need to be large de Laval nozzles. This is evidently the only way to shoot a liquid that high. How you get a granite to mimic a modern nozzle is beyond me. Moreover, a jet of water going at Mach 150 would need to overcome a lot of air resistance, something that Nichol and Brown have not provided any math for. If the water reaches the exosphere, which is where Nichol suggested that it cooled, it can also no longer fall as rain. So the highest it can go is the thermosphere, which reaches temperatures of 232 degrees Fahrenheit. The air there is thin, exacerbating problems as water can no longer stay in liquid form. The bottom line is there is no heat mitigation in any of these mechanisms. Firstly, if space is cooling the water, then the water can no longer fall as rain. But even if it could, the atmosphere is already vaporized due to the heat exchange on water's journey up to the exosphere. There's additional heat from the friction of the continents, which Walt suggests happened in hours, incredible. But even if we could mitigate that heat, we still have heat from the solidification and formation of limestone and the hardening of the magma, as well as all of the impact events from ejecta falling back down to Earth. Brown's model has such an enormous amount of heat and no way to mitigate it. At minimum, we're talking about 5,000 trillion 1 megaton H-bombs. But in addition, we also have lethal radiation produced from accelerated nuclear decay, dangerous electrical fields from creating the heavy elements with those piezoelectric effects, every impact event from the past 500 million years raining down as supercritical water spouts up and flash cooks the atmosphere, and the continents moving faster than race car speeds. It's no wonder that no one in Young Earth Creationism accepts Walt's ideas or even takes him seriously. Okay, so to sum it up, looking at the two most popular flood models, on one hand we have CPT with a tacit appeal to miracles or exotic future physics, and on the other hand we have Hydroplate with 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs. And this is why I like the heat problem so much. It's such a simple knockout argument for Young Earth Creationism, right? If you speed things up too much, then you vaporize the planet a few dozen times over. Noah's global flood is impossible without an appeal to exotic future physics or a miracle. Full stop. As just a fun little side note, while I was researching this, I came across a post comparing the pros and cons of hydroplate and catastrophic plate tectonics on the creationism subreddit, and the person who posted it 3 years ago now has a tag that says theistic evolutionist. So my gentle and of course very modern apes, keep this one in your back pocket, because as far as arguments against Young Earth Creationism goes, I think this one is on fire. If you like what I do here, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and if you want to support me in other ways, you can head on over to my Patreon and support me there. I am a TA and I have a mortgage, so every dollar helps.